Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. I can't tell you how grateful we are. I'm sorry, I have bad news. Mr. Armstrong will not be able to be with us today. He had to see the doctor this last week. He'd had a sore throat, actually not a sore throat, he'd had a spot on his vocal cords. It felt like he had something on it. It had been bothering him for about 3 weeks, and it just would not go away. So he finally went to see the doctor last Monday. And the doctor, we were a little worried, I don't mind telling you, but the doctor told him it was not serious, but he had developed an infection of the vocal cords. They were severely inflamed, and the doctor told him to shut up. He put him on a couple of prescriptions, actually 3 prescriptions. I think it was an antibiotic, an anti-inflammatory, and some tape for his mouth. Vocal silence is decreed for him for a time, and he was really torn. He felt that he could come up here and screech along, but he felt the stakes were a little too great for him personally and for the church as well, for him to take a chance on risking his voice further. And so with your permission, he asked me to come instead to speak to you today, and I was glad to be able to do that. It is really difficult, and I can tell you, if you know Governor Ted Armstrong, you know that he takes that very seriously indeed, that if there's any way at all that he could possibly have been here, that he would have been here. He's not just taking an easy out on himself. He's trying to be good for a change and do what the doctor told him to do. We were playing chess day before yesterday, and he was so quiet that as I defeated him soundly in the game of chess, he was reduced to using hand signals to express his frustration. So he also did ask me, though, to tell you that he would try to reschedule this just as soon as he possibly could, and to tell you how sincerely sorry he was not to be able to be here to be with you today. And when he sees the very fine turnout that we've had, he's going to be even more sorry. As you may know, the President of the United States, when he travels, has a military officer nearby, and that military officer is carrying a briefcase. Actually, the Secret Service probably watched that briefcase every bit as carefully as they watched the President, because that briefcase contains the communications material, codes and what have you, that would be necessary to start World War III. It has all the codes for nuclear weapons launches, permission to launch nuclear missiles, permission to launch bombers, permission for those bombers to launch their weapons in turn, permission for the submarines that are out there to launch the missiles that they have from under the ocean. The Secret Service, in their way of putting names on code names and everything, call that briefcase the football. The Russians have the same thing, as a matter of fact, and last week their term football would have been very appropriate for theirs, because the thing changed hands twice. That was something I hadn't thought much about. I'd worried about it a couple of years ago as the things began to change rapidly in the Soviet Union, and I was a little bit fearful that there might be a time when I didn't exactly expect a coup, but I expected instability, and I wondered in my mind, if the Soviet Union begins to crack at the seams, if things do begin to break down, which of the Soviet republics, which of the states, which of the officials would keep track of, have control of, all those scattered nuclear weapons that the Soviets have, which I believe to this date are still considerably greater in number than ours. Now, the coup leaders actually at one time had control of that briefcase. I presume before the week was out, it was back in the hands of Mikhail Gorbachev. Fortunately for all of us, no one dropped it. Apparently there was no serious danger, but it does make you think, doesn't it? And realize what a dangerous world this is. And when something as dangerous as what is contained in those 2 briefcases, one that never goes more than a few yards from the President of the United States, day or night, no matter where he is, I suppose the thing is out there in that boat with him when he's fishing up at Kennebunkport. The events of the last week were astonishing, to say the very least. Actually, I can't say that I would have been terribly surprised to have found over a period of months the Soviet Union evolving into a dictatorship. That I was dubious as to whether the communist system would be able to move smoothly to democracy, whether they would be able to handle the economic instability that was bound to come. For a people that had no history of democracy, that had no history of working with these problems, did not understand how to endure privation or hardship in that way. I mean, they have endured all sorts of privation and hardship, But they have not understood that whenever you have a problem in your political system, you continue to work through that problem within the political system. You don't throw it out the window. History has shown that economic collapse in countries has commonly led to dictatorships, and frankly, all of us have been a little bit frightened by it and worried about it. But the Soviet Union is not a banana republic, and so the coup attempt that a gang of thugs would come in and put Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest, take over the country and attempt a coup like this is something that I can speak for myself. I don't know about Mr. Armstrong because he hasn't been able to talk to tell me what he thinks about what happened. It came as something of a surprise. But then, the Soviet Union has been full of surprises the past few years. And of course, one thing that was almost as much a surprise as the coup itself was the fact that the coup failed. If those men, when they started out, had closed the airport, if they had had someone on hand to put the leader of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, under wraps as soon as it started, before he had a chance to say anything, if they had gotten the media under control and the communications things under control, one really realizes that they probably could have and would have pulled this thing off. And the Cold War would very likely be on again. As I say, there are a lot of surprising elements in what's gone on in the Soviet Union in the past week, the past year, the past 2 years. But you know, even in this, we have not been totally surprised. When I say we, I mean Mr. Armstrong and myself and those of us who are in this tradition of the study of world events. We have never believed, for example, that the Soviet Union would be the enemy of the United States at the end time. We have never believed that there would be a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. We have never imagined in our wildest dreams that we would go to war and we'd shoot missiles back and forth at each other and that would be the cataclysm that brought about the end of the age or the end of the world. And I can remember distinctly that even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when everyone was worried, when everyone had long faces and worried frowns, and when people in the White House were going to and fro and wondering whether or not the next few hours would see World War III begin, I distinctly remember Mr. Garner Ted Armstrong and his father Herbert W. Armstrong saying, we are not going to have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. How do you suppose they could have been so sure of that? And they were, I tell you, quite sure of it. And those who were around at that time, who were listening to them on television, who were hearing them in sermons in the church, know that they were quite confident at that time that there would be no war between the United States and the Soviet Union. How could they be so sure? Because it did not fit the pattern. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I need to take just a moment to explain a little bit of something to you about biblical prophecy. There is a scripture back in Isaiah, the 41st chapter, and I'll begin reading in verse 21. God, speaking through Isaiah, says, let them bring forth and show us what's going to happen. Let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them and know the latter end thereof. Now that's a kind of an odd expression in a way, but what he is saying in simple terms is this. He said, come on, show us what's going to happen in the future. And the way this is going to be done is you're going to show us what happened in the past so that we can look at what happened in the past and understand what's going to happen in the future. Now, why is that helpful? How can that be helpful? Well, you've all probably heard and have probably repeated the phrase in your lifetime, history repeats itself. There is a lot of truth in that. And when you come to a study of biblical prophecy, you begin to understand as you grow deeper into it, that in laying out a prophecy in Old Testament or New Testament, the prophet lays out a pattern of events. And if you studied it very long, you will realize that some of these patterns do repeat. And that some of them, even though the pattern existed in history and it was all laid out and we can follow it step by step through it, the prophet himself tells us that these historical events are a pattern which is going to exist again at the very time of the end. And they go further to tell us that the way we're going to understand what happens at the time of the end is because we have carefully looked at what happened in the past. The Bible presents patterns of prophecy which are not widely understood. One of the reasons that people do not understand them is because when they go to study prophecy in the Bible, they flop it open to the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel, and they begin to study through it and try to grasp what's going on here. One of the reasons they don't often understand is because they are solely concerned with what is going to happen and when it is going to happen. Well, that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? To be concerned with what is going to happen and when it is going to happen. Now, it may come as a surprise to you, but revealing to us a simple what-when combination is not the point of prophecy at all. That in the process of going in there and looking and trying to find all the what and all the when, most people, most preachers, I'm sorry to say, in the process of setting out to preach their sermons or write their books about biblical prophecy, overlook entirely one more question. The question is, why? It's not enough to know what's going to happen. It's not enough to know when it's going to happen if you could know when. You must know why. And unless you understand why in the process of it all, prophecy will never make any sense to you, and the study of it will be almost worthless to you. I was reading a book one day, and something I came to in the book surprised me somewhat. I had never heard it put this way at all. In the Bible, there are two forms of literature that have to do with the future. One of them is called prophecy. The other is called apocalyptic. That's a strange word. It comes from the Greek, and the word simply means revelation. In fact, the title of the book of Revelation in the Greek is apocalypsis, or the revealing is what it basically means. Two kinds of literature, prophecy, apocalyptic. What I read in this book said, it says that apocalyptic literature, like Revelation, contains almost no moral teaching at all. And I thought about that a moment, and I thought, that's true. That's absolutely true. When you get back and you read Amos, the shepherd prophet, there is a great deal of commentary about what God is going to do, that He's going to punish this nation. He's going to do it for these reasons. And, of course, the question is, why? And He ticks off their sins. He castigates them for the way of their lifestyle. He castigates them for the fact they turned their back on God. The book of Amos is just full and rich with moral principles and teachings, and with an explanation that in the violation of these moral principles and teachings, because of this, therefore God is going to do that. So there is a cause-effect relationship in prophetic literature. And so when you go back and read prophecy with an understanding of what's going to happen, if you don't understand why it is going to happen, you have the most important single element in prophecy is missing. Because the why is the important thing. Now, when you begin to understand this, you'll understand, I think, perhaps, why it is that these patterns of prophecy we saw, when we went back and saw the whys and the wherefores, not only what God was going to do, but also why He is going to do it, you might begin to understand why we saw patterns that were simply not being fulfilled. And these patterns are laid out in considerable detail. Now, you might wonder, well, if that's the case, why is the book of Revelation even in the Bible? Because if you think about it, why would God want to go to the trouble to tell you what's going to happen in the future? Now, you and I have got every reason to want to know what's going to happen in the future, don't we? Would it be of any value to you to know whether the stock market at the end of this year, on December 31st, would be at 4,000 on the Dow or 2,000 on the Dow? Would it be worth anything? Well, if you know anything about it, you know it would be worth an enormous amount to you to know which direction that thing was going to go between now and the end of the year. Do you think God cares whether you know that or not? He couldn't care less whether you know that or not. It has nothing to do with His plan. And so when He comes to the point to where He looks down here, and here are a bunch of people, and God says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to reveal to this group of people seated here what is going to happen in the future. Why on earth do you suppose God would do a thing like that? Well, it's interesting, and I want to leave that question just for a moment and come back to it. Probably the biggest mistake that we all made back in the 1960s, we got caught up in the what and when. in the fallacy of prophecy. And it is a fallacy, this thing of chasing down the whats and the whens. Now, you know, in prophecy, in Daniel and Revelation, there are all sorts of prophecies that have some little time element in them. 1,216 days, 1,335 days, 42 months, 3.5 years, times, and half a times. And you look at these things and you think, my, well, if we know this, then we know that. And it's so tempting to spend your time trying to work out all these scenarios. And I don't know how many I have read in the years gone by of scenarios that people have written out concerning prophecy. I feel safe in making one statement, that the more specific a person, a preacher, or whoever he may be is, in attempting to write out a scenario of prophecy, the more certain he is to be wrong. Because the truth is that that isn't given to us. There is a reason why those prophecies are there and a reason why they are not. It's interesting to me to realize, I asked the question, why is the book of Revelation there? You see, when you go all the way through the Old Testament, you find prophecy after prophecy after prophecy. Not apocalypse, prophecy, with moral teaching on top of moral teaching about right and wrong. Now, what you may not know about the book of Revelation, but what you can find out very readily if you have a version that has marginal notes in it that have chain references, is that the book of Revelation is heavily chained in your Bible back to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. You'll find reference upon reference upon reference. Many of the prophecies are almost identical. In some cases, the wording of them is even the same. What happens here is that God comes along in the person of John, long after Jesus was dead and buried and after his ascension to the Father, long after Paul is dead and buried, long after most of the apostles are dead and buried, when all this idea that Christ was going to come somewhere in the first century had kind of passed by the board, he appeared to John in vision and gave him a revelation, which revelation to John showed him that all of the patterns out of the prophecy, of the old prophets, all those patterns are picked up and set down firmly in the future. They are going to happen again. Babylon of old, the fall of it was prophesied by Isaiah, and it fell. All of a sudden, here comes Jeremiah saying, there's going to be, John in Revelation saying, there's going to be another Babylon, and that one is going to fall. He even comes along, and the angel does, and says, Babylon the Great is fallen. Almost implying in the statement itself that Babylon's fall this time was going to be the second time around. The book of Revelation serves to reactivate, if that's the word for it, all those Old Testament prophecies. And every one of them contains the why. If you read Revelation alone and you know nothing of the history of these things, you will not understand prophecy. One of the reasons why Herbert W. Armstrong and Garner Ted Armstrong put together the why and put together their whole prophetic structure and pattern so effectively was because they did precisely that. They looked at the book of Revelation, they looked at the marginal note, and they looked back and read in the Old Testament, and they saw why it was going to happen. In the process of seeing why, they began to look for the pattern to happen again. Herbert W. Armstrong, Garner Ted Armstrong's father, saw that pattern developing before World War II. He didn't quite know, and I think really looking back on it, he can be excused, really, or forgiven, for having got caught up in the date-setting fallacy, because, boy, it did look like it was coming down the pike. It was really coming down the mountain at all of us at the beginning of World War II. There were so many of the Old Testament patterns, and the statements had been made in the Bible, both in Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Revelation, and it looked like that pattern was all of a sudden finding repetition in World War II. And the truth is, the pattern was there. But the thing that is never there in the pattern is time. The question when is not answered. Well, it is in one way. The question, every time one of us asks God when about something, it seems he says soon. We need to realize, of course, soon to him is not quite the same as it is to us. But nevertheless, it's a pattern or a mistake that we have oftentimes gotten into. We make these mistakes because we forget why God bothers with prophecy in the first place. All right? There you sit. God decides he wants to reveal something to you. Why is he doing it? There are two reasons. In fact, there are two and only two reasons why God ever reveals the future to one man, two men, a dozen men, or a company of men. One, God reveals the future to you because He wants you to do something about it. Two, He wants you to know about the future because He wants you to know that He did it. Not somebody else, not an accident, not nature, that He did it. Because a prophet has come along and said, this is going to happen, this is the reason it's going to happen. When it takes place, it's not just nature, it's not just a volcano, it's not just an earthquake, it's not just another storm. We can see the hand of God in the things that take place on this earth, and we can only see the hand of God in it when God sends a prophet and tells us before it happened. I could have come along up there and talked all I wanted to about God having brought about the explosion of Mount St. Helens up there when it blew up. After the fact, who would have believed me if I had told them that it was God that did it? I don't believe it was in this particular case, for there was no such prophet. But if it had been His intent, if He was doing something and He had a reason for doing it, He would have sent a prophet ahead of time and said, it's going to blow. We're going to have this happen. This is going to be the pattern. This is the way it's going to go about. And here is why it is going to happen. Without the why, the whole thing becomes an exercise in futility. Now, I want to show you in the Bible these two particular reasons and how they work. I'm going all the way back to one of the very first prophecies ever listed in the Bible. Genesis chapter 18. I don't know if you realize we got prophecy in the Bible that early or not, but indeed we do. In the 18th chapter of Genesis, God and two angels appeared to Abraham, came walking down the dusty road toward his place. He saw them, and somehow he seems to have known who they were. Probably because he had seen God, who was in one of these three, before. Apparently, when God decided to get together with Abraham or to present Himself to Abraham, He commonly did so in the flesh. On this occasion, He was apparently able to sit down and eat and drink with Abraham, which again is quite an activity of the flesh. That, however, is another subject. After the meal and all the interaction was over, and I'm going to begin reading in Genesis 18 and verse 16. The men rose up from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on their way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which He has spoken of him. Now think about this. God, walking away from Abraham's home, with Abraham alongside of him, says to Himself, shall I tell him or not? Now here is the question that comes up immediately. Why does God ever tell anyone what He is going to do in the future? Here's the question asked. Shall I? He said, yes, I will. Why will He? Because I know Him, that He will command His children and His household after Him, and they will keep the way of the Lord. And listen to then how He proceeds. The Lord said, because. This is the operative word, when you come down to prophecy. Not just apocalyptic, but real prophecy. The word because is almost always going to be there. Why am I doing this? Abraham had a right to know. If God was going to tell him at all, he had a right to know. So God said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grievous. I will go down now, and I'll see whether they have done according to the cry of it which is unto me, and if not, I will know. The men turned their faces from there and went toward Sodom. Abraham stood yet before the Lord. Here follows this utterly fascinating encounter between God and a man, where Abraham says, he knew what God was talking about. He said, are you going to destroy the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous within the city? Will you also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? I love this. This passage to me is a tremendous inspiration. As a man of God makes intercession, talks God down, bargains him down, if you will, and God stands right there and allows him to do it, just like he allowed Jacob to wrestle with him all one night when he didn't have to. God did not have to tell Abraham. He told him. He did not have to listen to all this. He listened. He did not have to give in. He gave in. He went as far as Abraham went. Kept saying it. If I find 10 there, I won't destroy it for the 10. Why did God tell Abraham? Well, there was nothing in particular for Abraham to do other than to tell his children. But you see, this is the point of the second reason I gave you. God wants us to know that He did it. He wants us to know why He did it. And He wants us to convey it to others as well, why He did it. He doesn't want people sitting around wringing their hands and saying, well, it was just bad luck. He doesn't want them sitting around saying, God did all these things to me and it wasn't my fault. God did all these things to me and I don't understand why. God wants them to know why. It is the role of the prophet's office, and not just of the prophet. It's the role of all those who know why. It's the role of all those who know why to tell others why. I can see people now saying, well, Lord, if you had just told me, I'd have repented. I don't understand why you did this to me. And it's no good going to them after the fact and telling, well, God did it to you because you did that. Then all they're going to do is say, well, why didn't you tell me then? I would have repented if you would have told me then. It's no good telling them, well, you wouldn't have either, because, in fact, you never gave them a chance. God wanted Abraham to know that what was about to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't a volcano, that it wasn't just a crack in the earth, that it wasn't just a natural disaster. He wanted him to know it was the hand of God, and he wanted him to know why. But that's not the end of the story. In the 19th chapter, beginning in verse 1, it says, there 2 angels came to Sodom at even. And Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. So here come these angels into his house. I'll pass over most of the story because it would just take up time without adding to what I'm trying to tell you right now. Verse 15 is where I want to continue. When the morning arose, the angels hastened to Lot, saying, arise, take your wife. I'm sorry, I actually don't want to go quite that far. Verse 12. The men said to Lot, have you here any besides, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, whatever you have in this city, we want you to bring them out of this place. We want you to get them, and we want you to get them out of here. For we will destroy this place, because the cry of them has waxed great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Here is another case. The same event, another prophecy, because you see, this is a prophecy here. They have just told Lot what is about to happen, right? This is coming. It's going to happen. And they told him why it's going to happen. But you see, they told Lot for an entirely different reason from what they told Abraham. They told Lot because Lot was expected to do something about what they told him. He was expected to get out of there. He was also expected to tell anyone who was important to him. His sons, his daughters, whoever might listen to him. To get out because of what God was about to do. Why does Almighty God decide to reveal the future to anyone, anytime? Because He wants them to know that it was His hand. And 2, He wants them to do something about it. And in relation to both of these, He wants them to tell somebody what happened. In other words, to bear witnesses. Now, there are a lot of things that I don't know about the future. Just a lot of things and a lot of details. But I do know what God is doing. And I do know why God is doing it. Oh, I don't know everything about why He's doing it, but I know enough. I know enough for it to be critical. What I don't know is when. But we are learning more every day about these things that God is doing here below. And because we have the pattern, and folks, we do have the pattern. I can't give it all to you today. It's a little warm in here, and I don't think it'll last that long. I might not last that long. We have the pattern, and we know what to watch for. And it's why when the boats were going back and forth to Cuba with missiles on them, we weren't starting out in the backyard digging fallout shelters expecting a nuclear war to break out. We did not believe that that was going to happen at that time. There are some things, though, that we know. We know also that we are entering one of the most dangerous periods in the history of mankind. The instability, actually, the period of time, people worried a lot about nuclear weapons. They'd lie awake night just worrying about nuclear weapons. But do you realize that since 1945, not one person has died of a nuclear weapon? When you think about it for a moment, that's rather significant. What other weapon that man has can you tell me or name for me that has killed no one else since 1945? If it may be something that was invented yesterday or has been only available a couple of months, no other weapon that man has ever made has gone that long a period of time without killing anybody. I think everybody looked at that and saw what happened, and they didn't want any more of that. We know, though, that we are entering a dangerous time because of the instability that is beginning to come about in the world. The instability in Russia has created a major problem for the world. I think all of us know that. We've been seeing it on the news broadcast, and I won't belabor that here. We also know that President Bush's vision of a new world order will fail. It's a noble vision. The idea that the great powers will work together and try to bring peace in the world. The idea that we'll try not to go to war, that we'll try to create negotiations, that we will work with these people here, we'll let the United Nations and bring their force to bear. It's a noble idea. And there's been no time in my lifetime when we have had a greater hope of that taking place. The Bible tells us we come down to the very end of this age that the ambassadors of peace will weep bitterly. One of the reasons they're going to weep so bitterly is because they thought they had it in their grasp. I'm sorry to tell you that the New World Order will fail. We know that a diabolical and evil world order will be imposed upon the earth at the end time. We know that some people, as this diabolical world order begins to impose its will upon mankind, we know that some people will be protected. We don't believe that they're going to be dragged off to some bunch of caves in the desert anywhere. We believe that many of them will be protected right where they sit. Daniel's place of safety, if you will, was in the lion's den. No one was going to bother him there. He slept in peace. We know that God will protect people from that time. We also know that Jesus Christ will come again, and He will put a stop to the destruction of the earth, the destruction of man, the destruction of children. It's going to stop, folks. But we know that it can't stop until Jesus Christ comes back and forces it to stop. We believe that because we've come across this, because God has given it to us, because we see it, we believe it's our job to keep on telling the world what is coming, and perhaps more important than that, to tell the world why it is coming. I hope we've learned our lesson about trying to tell them when. But it is so scary sometimes when you start seeing things happen, you do sometimes feel that it's near, that it is at the door. We believe that that is our job. I'm here today to extend an invitation to all of you to join with us in that job. Pitch in and help out. Help make other people aware of it. Do what you can. Because after all, once you know, and once you see, and once you begin to understand why, isn't there somebody that you know, like Lot with his sons, or his daughters-in-law, or his other children whom he talked to and tried? I realize that in many cases it will go nowhere. They laughed at him. They scoffed at him. They ridiculed everything he said. And when the time came for him to get out of there, the angels had to come to him and say, it's time to go. And he said, well, maybe they're going to come. Can we wait just a little bit longer? I know my boys should, I want them out of here. He wasn't lingering because he loved Sodom. He wasn't lingering because he didn't believe it was going to happen. He knew it was going to happen. He hated Sodom. He lingered because he cared. And the time came when the angel took hold of him, and they just actually took him by the hand and drug him out of the city and shoved him on up down the road and gave him a pat and said, keep going that way and don't look back. You know the story. Lot's wife did look back and was turned into a pillar of salt. That time may come for us. But there's one thing you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about figuring out when it is. Because the when in all these prophetic elements is mercifully absent. Why then do you ask? Are those 1,335 days and 1,260 days and 42? Why are those all in there? You will understand those things and why they are there at the end of the period of time, not at the beginning. Because you see, you won't even know it was 1,335 days until it's over. The reason those little patterns of time, days, and counting are there are not so you'll know when to run. Lot didn't know when to run. He didn't have to know when to run. They took hold of him and took him out of town. That's all you got to know and all you got to believe. The reason those days and months are there is so that when it has come to pass, you will know that God did it. It was not an accident. It was not just man. It was not nature. It was not time and chance. It was the hand of God. And you will be able to be a witness of that simply because you saw the pattern. As I said, we want to invite all of you to be with us in this and to join in with us in this. And if you, for those of you who have had some contact with the Worldwide Church of God and you realize that Mr. Armstrong's father, the founder of the Worldwide Church of God, and he split up in 1978, you realize that there are a lot of similarities between us and the Worldwide Church of God. And some people who have attempted to attend the Worldwide Church of God have kind of gone away with a little bit of a bad impression because of it's a simple thing to say, and I don't think it's any exaggeration at all, that there is a very important difference between the Worldwide Church of God and the Church of God International. The Worldwide Church of God is an exclusive church. The Church of God International is an open church. Many of you who have tried to attend the Worldwide Church of God have either been delayed or turned down or turned away for one reason or another. In the Church of God International, you don't have to ask anybody if you can come to church. Just come. You're welcome. You'll be met with open arms. You will find a very small church, but a very warm and a very loving church and a very caring church who are committed to and who believe in the things that you believe in. The Church of God International doesn't differ as much from the Worldwide Church of God in doctrine as we do in our fundamental value system. For us, you, the people whom God calls, are the important thing. It's what the church exists for. You are what the church is to serve. You are welcome to attend with our brethren here in Springfield anytime, no strings attached, and no questions asked. If you can't make it to church, and I realize that a lot of you people have come from all over. If you can't make it to church, I'm going to reveal to you today one of the well-kept secrets of the Church of God International. We have a program we call the Extended Church. Because so many of our people are so scattered, we make available every week a cassette tape recording of our church services in Tyler. Speaker one week will be Mr. Armstrong, next week it'll be me. We alternate quite a little bit depending upon who's traveling and who's home. And sometimes if both of us are gone, you may hear from Bronson James or Charles Gross or Larry Watkins or one of the other of us who holds out there at headquarters. We will, if you'd like to have this service, we will mail you every week a copy of the Sabbath tape, the cassette tape of the Sabbath services in Tyler the preceding week. We'll hold church there today. By next week, you'll have a cassette tape of it. You can sit down on the Sabbath afternoon with your family and punch the tape recorder on and have a cup of coffee and listen to what went on in church in Tyler the last time. The only condition I have for you getting on the program, you can call the Tyler office. You can write the Tyler office. Just tell them when you call that you were at the Springfield campaign and Ronald Dart told you that you could be put on the tape program, the weekly tape program, and the operator will be very happy to take down information and to put you on that weekly tape program, and we'll be glad to send it to you week after week after week. There is no charge. There is no charge. Remember now, as you leave here today, there are only two reasons why God will ever let you know what He is about to do. One of them is because He wants you to know that He is doing it. He wants you to see His hand in history. There is one other reason why God will tell you what He is about to do. He wants you to do something about it. Thank you for coming. May God bless and keep every one of you on your way home.